Unit 5, Social Psychology. Presentation 4, Explanations of why people obey.
Research into obedience has shown that ordinary people can apparently carry out extraordinarily destructive acts when under the influence of an authority figure. Having demonstrated that people will obey authority, the next step is to find out why. In this presentation, we examine 3 different explanations of why people obey.
During his study of obedience, Stanley Milgram regularly carried out what he referred to as the prediction exercise, asking different groups of people to predict how far participants would go when delivering shocks to a learner when told to do so by a person in authority. Almost universally, they predicted that few, if any, would go to the full 450 volts. However, perhaps Milgram was asking the wrong question. Instead, he might have asked what percentage of participants would deliver a 450-volt shock having already given a 435-volt shock. In other words, if the escalation into evil is gradual, does this make it harder for people to resist?
Explanation 1. Gradual commitment. Obedience becomes more likely when the initial order is small and the increase in the magnitude of the commands gradually increases. In his research, Milgram discovered that once participants had committed themselves to giving lower level shocks, they found it harder to resist the experimenter's commands to give higher and higher levels of shock. Only at the beginning of the experiment was the participant asked to do something new, and the initial request was mild and relatively unobjectionable to deliver a very small 15-volt shock. Beyond 15 volts, they are merely being asked to continue what they had done already.
We must remember that for Milgram's participants to stop giving shocks, they would then have to justify the shocks they had already given up to that point. Stopping was made even harder because the transition from one shock level to another was very gradual, in small 15-volt increments. For example, participants might reason, if I've just given him a 60-volt shock, what's wrong with a 75-volt shock? It's just a little bit more. If I've just given him a 75-volt shock, what's wrong with a 90-volt shock? And so on.
As a result of this gradual commitment, the majority of Milgram's participants continued up to the 450-volt level, something they most probably would not have done had they been asked to deliver the 450 volts at the beginning of the experiment. As each shock was only slightly higher than the previous one, this is an example of what psychologists call the foot in the door approach. Once someone has signalled their willingness to agree to a small request, their ability to resist larger requests from the same source is weakened.
Evaluation of gradual commitment as an explanation of obedience. Evidence for the influence of gradual commitment comes from Robert J. Lifton's interviews with Nazi doctors at the end of the Second World War. In the early 1940s, experiments were carried out on large numbers of prisoners in the Nazi concentration camps. The doctors who carried out these experiments in death camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau began by being required to carry out sterilizations of the mentally disabled, and then to carry out more and more extreme experiments that frequently resulted in death or permanent disability. By agreeing to the initial smaller commands, these doctors subsequently found it more difficult to refuse later commands, no matter how extreme.
Explanation 2. The role of buffers. The term buffer in this context refers to anything that protects an individual from experiencing the true consequences of their action. In Milgram's study, the teacher and learner were in separate rooms. Therefore, when the teacher delivered an electric shock, he did not have to witness its consequences. In a pilot study for the main research, where the teacher could see the movements of the learner through a frosted glass window, Milgram noted that most would turn their head away at the point where they actually delivered the shocks. Buffers such as physical distance therefore protect the individual from some of the distress they would otherwise experience when they harm another person.
Evaluating the role of buffers as an explanation of obedience. We need only to look as far as Milgram's own studies to provide the strongest evidence in support of the importance of buffers in determining the likelihood of obedience. Milgram carried out one series of 4 experiments where the main situational factor, proximity of the teacher to the learner, was systematically varied. In the first, the learner was in another room and could be neither seen nor heard. In the second, the learner could be heard protesting loudly about the shocks. In the third, the teacher could hear and see the learner, and in the final study, the teacher had to physically place the learner's hand onto a shock plate whenever he made a mistake.
Each of these variations removed one of the buffers protecting the teacher from witnessing the consequences of their obedience. Not surprisingly, as each buffer was removed, not only did the maximum shock level given by the teacher decrease, but so did the duration of the shocks given. This was measured by how long participants held down the switches on the shock generator, and is an indication of how disturbing participants found their task in the absence of buffers.
Explanation 3. Agentic shift. Milgram believed that when people obey, they shift from what he referred to as an autonomous state to an agentic state. In the autonomous state, a person sees themselves as acting on their own and therefore responsible for their actions. The individual no longer views himself as responsible for his own actions, but sees himself as an instrument or agent for carrying out the wishes of someone else. In the agentic state, our conscience is momentarily switched off or replaced by the conscience of the authority figure.
Milgram believed that this notion of agentic shift explained the behaviour of the obedient participants in his study. They were able to shift from an autonomous to an agentic state when the experimenter reminded them that he would be responsible for anything that happened to the learner.
Agentic shift is probably the consequence of childhood socialization experiences. We are taught from an early age to be obedient to authority in all aspects of our life. As a result, we tend to respond unquestioningly to the requests of authority because we believe these to be fair and appropriate.
For example, in Milgram's study, the participant sees the experimenter as a legitimate authority figure because of his professional status and his level of education. To refuse his requests, therefore, would require going against a deeply ingrained belief that people in authority command respect and so must be obeyed.
Evaluation of agentic shift as an explanation of obedience. The evidence supporting the importance of agentic shift in explaining obedience is unfortunately weak. For example, Mantell and Panzarella, in a replication of Milgram's obedience study, found no relationship between the degree of obedience shown by participants and the degree to which they held the authority figure as responsible for their actions. They found that both obedient and defiant participants accepted total responsibility for their own actions. Many of the participants who showed complete obedience held themselves responsible for making the decision to continue.
Interestingly enough, over a third of Milgram's fully obedient participants also held themselves responsible for their actions and did not assign responsibility to the authority figure. These findings challenge Milgram's claim that obedience is dependent on agentic shift.
What can we conclude? Milgram's analysis of the behaviour of his experimental participants revealed many different reasons for their obedient behaviour. We should remember that a behaviour as complex as obedience is likely to be the consequence of many different explanatory factors, some of which may be more prominent at any one time, but which often occur together.